Welcome back, folks. I see David is enjoying the little elevator music we have in there.
Good choice of music. That was very nice.
So David is on next to talk about new regulatory building blocks for payments. Take it away.
Very good. Thank you. All right. So what I want to talk about here is what's happening in regulations and what is coming up in the future that I think this community wants to really just be aware of, to be able to kind of have some headlights for what's coming down the road a little bit further. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk more about CBDC in particular and how CBDC relates with what Mojaloop is doing. But for today, I want to just spend a little bit of time to talk about this issue of regulation and what we see happening. Over the past couple of years, we've seen some real acceleration around the technologies for doing digital payments, as well as digital currencies. Even though things like Bitcoin, blockchain got started around 10, 11 years ago, there's really been a renewed focus on this in recent times. What really in the last couple of years has accelerated the focus and this turn more towards regulation has been the introduction of a lot of stablecoin projects, as well as the challenges of cross-border payments. And that's the area here that I'm going to spend a little more time on today to talk about stablecoins, cross-border, how it has impacted regulations. And these are regulations that are upcoming. They're not all in place today. And of course, a lot of this was brought to light in 2019 when we had the introduction of Libra, the concept of Libra. Now it's called Diem. And that has played a role here to cause a lot of governments, a lot of central banks to sit back and think about, all right, what could be the impact of that? And how does it fit in with all the other moving parts we have? There are a lot of moving parts right now when it comes to payments. There are initiatives in a lot of countries for instant payments. You have initiatives which Mojaloop supports for interoperability. There are initiatives for open banking, the PSD2 regulations in Europe, open banking, and those are being copied in a lot of other places as a concept. You also have the central bank digital currencies. And in all of this, the governments are faced with, all right, how do all these moving parts fit together? And how is it that we want supervision to work? How do we want customer protection to work? How we implement issues around privacy? All of this has to kind of blend in. So we were more or less on a path towards digital currencies up until this. We saw the projects that were just mentioned around Sweden and their efforts. There's other countries that have done CBDC kinds of projects. But now they're looking at it in a different context. They're saying, all right, what do we do with stablecoins and cross-border payments in this regard? So we know regulations are going to continue to play a major role in payments. Right now, the G20 is under Saudi leadership, the presidency of the G20, and they've established a work plan that's really trying to address all in particular, these topics about stablecoins and cross-border payments, and to create a roadmap for that. They've combined the efforts of CPMI, which is the Committee on Payment Market Infrastructure at the BIS, under the BIS Secretariat, as well as the Financial Stability Board. And so we're going to look at some of these. So what is the point? Well, the payment hubs like Mojaloop will evolve over time. We're focused now on what it takes to implement the basic interoperability. Over time, we're going to see new use cases. We're going to see how do you provide for perhaps multiple currencies, or even the same currency, but cross-border. like in a monetary union. So there's going to be things which will, I think, bring forward new use cases, and they're going to be impacted by what we're seeing happen in regulations. There's other systems for virtual assets that may also be introduced if in some countries they have initiatives to extend other than cash through digital payment means. And what I mean here is there are some CBDC initiatives, particularly right now happening in the Caribbean, in which they're not just talking about fiat money, they're talking also about securities, and they're also talking in some places around offering retail bonds and things like this through the same basic mechanisms. So there's some of that. There's international standards for anti-money laundering and the financing of terrorist activities that apply. And we can expect that Mojaloop will be impacted by some of these future requirements. And it's an evolving set. And that's why I wanted to spend some time today to just talk about what has happened during 2020 in this regard. So in the future, we also know cross-border of the same currency, monetary unions. And if we look at Africa, there's a couple of them that have been talked about for a long time and perhaps will begin to take shape here in the next few years. So in the former French portion of Africa with the CFA, we see that migrating towards an ECHO currency, which would expand the countries involved. I think you would probably add Cabo Verde to that, add Nigeria to that, and you have a large population under a common currency potentially. Southern Africa as well, around South Africa and the region, has also been talked about as another monetary area. So there will be certainly circumstances where you can have cross-border of the same currency. And then, of course, there's cross-border of different currencies. So when we look at this, as I say, we're going to focus on just two areas, stablecoins and cross-border. And I want to share with you and make available to you where to find these reports. These are studies that have already completed. And I'm going to share in this presentation just some of the highlights of what these studies have reported back to the G20 on their recommendations for how regulations will affect stablecoins and how regulations might apply to cross-border. What's on the right is what the BIS has published for a long time called their money flower. And this was created as a way to explain, well, where does the central bank play a role on digital currencies, either at a wholesale level, at a retail level, and also on this, there's a few other instances where you would see there's private digital token as well. Now, in this presentation, I've got a lot of words, and I'm not going to go through all the words that are in here. What I've done is I've tried to package into this set of charts the story and the links and the references, more or less so that this presentation can be a reference point independent of today's talk. So this has already been posted to the agenda page for today's meeting. And in it hopefully is self-contained enough to lead you to find where to get more information. So I've put a lot in it just to be able to have the information all in one place. So the Financial Action Task Force addressed the issue of stablecoins in the context of existing regulations that they have produced for the industry in the past. And this was provided in June. And this was, they looked at, well, what are the money laundering and financing of terrorism issues that are related to stablecoins? They took the effort to define how they are considering stablecoins for purposes of this. And this organization, FATF, has already done a lot of work around regulations for virtual assets. So they're trying to relate, okay, how does a stablecoin compare with other virtual assets? and the other institutions that work with virtual assets. How will this set of standards, as they're revised, apply? And what are the residual risks? So there's some inherent risks in stablecoins. We've got a set of standards already that we've developed. So how well do we address it? What are the risks that are left over? And then is there a global money laundering kind of framework that comes from this? Interesting, they also extended this study a little bit to include in their annex central bank digital currencies. And for those that haven't already heard my name somewhere or another, I'm involved directly on central bank digital currencies. And we're going to have a presentation tomorrow where I'll describe more about that. So the highlights of the stablecoin report, they recognize that stablecoins share many of the same potential risks as other kinds of virtual assets. They're looking at things like the anonymity, and this is a little odd for me because part of my screen is covered up with our Zoom stuff, so I'm not going to take the time to push those out of the way because I'll end up coming out of this presentation mode. Also, we have developers, governance bodies of these stablecoins, obligation. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of these points. Like I say, I include a lot of them so that if you have a particular interest in this, this becomes a document you can come back to. Their concern, of course, was heightened when the plans for Libra were first discussed by the Libra Association, which now is Diem. And their concerns were, of course, the potential for mass adoption. And how does that change the dynamic of how this kind of technology would be brought forward and used? You have value-added service providers as well that are already included in some of the regulations. And so their interest was, what is it that we have to protect against if stablecoins become something which is exposed to the very large scale mass adoption that comes from the having a large organization that's behind it? The position that they've taken for this is that for their purposes, they see central bank digital currencies are not virtual assets. And as was just talked about in the last presentation, CBDCs are fiat currency. They're not backed by fiat currency. They are fiat currency. They're not a virtual asset. But they do recognize that there is the potential for money laundering risks even greater than what exists with cash. These standards that FATF has had will apply. Sorry about that. They will apply, the standards that are there will apply for central bank digital currencies and other kinds of fiat currencies that are issued from the central bank. But I think the main points are the ones that are here at the bottom, that when you're talking about digital currencies of any sort, there is an impact on the anonymity and the peer-to-peer transactions that occur. And that when you're using things like a CBDC, I can't see this screen and I've got to move this out of my way. Here we go. That's just a tiny bit better. Sorry for that. Let me move on here so I take advantage of the time that we have. Let me switch over to cross-border payments for this. Cross-border payments, of course, has always been an important part of the inclusion agenda. What we have here on the left is just a snapshot of the magnitude of this around the world. What I show on the right is really the set of use cases. There's a broad set of use cases that, in particular for cross-border payments at the retail level, this is kind of the universe that we would want to be sure we have addressed and be sure that are covered. And these are the examples of the kinds of transactions that I think the G20 was particularly focused on being able to address with their needs. They produced, or they've asked for, a roadmap. The G20 requested that there be a roadmap for this, working with CPMI, working with the Financial Stability Board. They divided it into 3 reports. There was a stage 1 report issued in April. Stage 2 was issued in July. Stage 3 was issued in October. They've focused on this to make this a priority, partly because they recognize that they're coming from behind. And as so often the case, regulations lag behind the technology. They could see that the technology is sufficiently far advanced where you could have a cross-border technology in place, a stablecoin with mass adoption could be happening faster than we think. And so this was something they felt an urgency to try to address. They recognize that there are many challenges today for cross-border between costs, the speed, limited access, insufficient transparency to the user. They wanted to address the existing frictions that are inherent in this. And they recognize, though, on the other side of the coin, that financial innovation is creating opportunities that can make payments more efficient. So how do we bring out the best in providing cross-border payments? So they see the potential for technical innovation here to build on the systems that exist and make the improvements through new structures, new ecosystems. So they set up a 3-stage program. First stage, let's assess what we have. What's the review of the existing practices? What are the building blocks that we need to create that can lead the work towards improvements in cross-border payment arrangements? And then the third, what do you recommend as a roadmap? Back to the FSB to coordinate with CPMI the development of a roadmap. And if you're not familiar with these different organizations, we have a link here at the bottom of the page that'll take you to what they're doing. So these 3 stages were already addressed. A lot of work. The reports that are published are included in a reading list at the end. I'm going to quickly go through what it was that they found in this. In stage 1, at the assessment stage, that's really looking at, okay, what do we know about cross-border payments in general, not being very country specific, but just broadly across the board. CPMI in stage 2 led the work on creating building blocks. There are 19 building blocks arranged in, I think it's 6 or 7 different areas to really address how to improve the current arrangements. And then, of course, a roadmap in stage 3, which says, all right, how can we organize all of this so that we can move forward with some practical steps? And what's the time frame for doing that? So, operational improvement of the existing payment infrastructures. These are the issues that they wanted to really focus in. Are there initiatives that the public authorities can take to enhance these key public infrastructures? Things like the real-time gross settlement process, automated clearinghouses, instant payments, and the desire to enhance interoperability. And you know, I think throughout this, I really felt the opportunity for Moja Loop to be a key way in which the kinds of building blocks that they anticipate and the kind of work that could come out of these regulations, Mojaloop is very well positioned to play a role, a major role in this. And that's what I wanted to highlight. The other thing, the next thing they looked at is standardization of data and market practice. When they look at the existing scenario of cross-border payments, and they're asking here, well, what steps can the public or the private sector take to increase the use of standard message format protocols and other mechanisms that are going to ensure interoperability? That's right smack in the middle of where Mojaloop makes an impact. More broadly, part 3 of this first stage report that the FSB issued was around the oversight framework. And they're looking at, of course, what are the initiatives that can be taken to improve the efficiency and to reduce the cost of anti-money laundering and other compliance processes. They don't want to compromise on the quality of compliance. They want to have the tools they need to be able to enhance what they're doing for anti-money laundering without getting in the way of delivering services for those that are using it. So this is where there's a concept in regulation that has to meet the opportunity in technology. They talk about things like greater use of a legal entity identifier and digital IDs for individuals. And we just talked about that, about how do you make authentication and authorization improvements in the system in the last session. So how do you get past the typical roadblocks of trying to authenticate these users? How do you incorporate national ID databases? They see the need here. They're looking for the way in which the way technology is developing can fulfill this need, but they're very clear they're looking for there to be advancements in this area. Progress monitoring, information sharing. Of course, they're looking for stronger dialogue, stronger open dialogue. In stage 2, what the CPMI produced in their report, and there's really 2 reports here. They kind of have the overview report and they have a technical detail report, which goes into each one of these areas in a great deal more, a lot more detail. Cross-border challenges. So they focus on the high cost of payments, low speed, limited access, and limited transparency, especially focused around costs. And around that, they've defined these 7 frictions, which are the things which have been obstacles for cross-border payments all along. But it's not until recently that I think the motivation to address these frictions has really built up. And it took the threat of Libra, I think, to really say, now we have a motivation. We, as a group of central banks, as the public sector governance, we need to have a story around how will cross-border payments really be handled, and especially so if there are private sector initiatives that could quickly dominate through their broad adoption. So these kinds of frictions, like weak competition, because there are so many significant barriers to entry, the low rate of straight-through processing that exists in the existing environment, complexities in meeting compliance, all of these things, the limited operating hours, legacy technology platforms, the long transaction chains, the fact that you've got all these multiple direct connections that are required, and of course the costs involved. I put stars along these 3 because from my point of view, Mojaloop can have an extremely positive impact when it comes to addressing some of the things that are more technology oriented to reducing these frictions. Mojaloop can play a big role, and these are the areas that the G20 wants to have addressed. If we look at these 5 areas and the building blocks that they've defined, there are, again, three large areas here that I think are very relevant for Mojaloop. And as all this work progresses into the future, these are the areas that I think the organization here really needs to maintain visibility to, and to see who's participating, what are the drivers for it, what are the kinds of solutions that are being discussed, how does Mojaloop adapt to these different building blocks. This work being done by CPMI and the Financial Services Board will find its way into the governments and into the central banks. And these studies become more or less for them the roadmap that they will look to say, well, how do the initiatives that we need in this country conform within this model? And that's why I thought it was relevant to raise it here with Mojaloop and talk about these things in terms of where can Mojaloop really make a difference for this. Among these five areas, you have public and private sector commitment, regulatory, the second one, regulatory, supervisory, and oversight frameworks. C on the bottom right here is existing payment infrastructures and arrangements. And there's 5 different things here that I'm going to show you on another page. The next one under D, the data and market practices impacts with the work here at Mojaloop. New payment under E, new payment infrastructures and arrangements. And this is where they anticipate integrating central bank digital currencies with these initiatives. So in the past, what I had seen, and I had met with a number of different central banks since 2015, what we often heard, and what I personally heard in meeting with different central banks, was they were looking at CBDC as an island. They were looking at it as its own issue. And what do we need to do to provide a central bank digital currency and the benefits and all of this? How does it help them to fulfill their social goals? What's happened now is the scope has broadened. And when things like stablecoins came forward and Libra, and then they started to look at other projects and cross-border became something on their radar more intently, then they said, all right, we're not just going to go forward with just CBDC by itself. We have to fit that together with these other issues. And the impact on the market is now CBDC is going to take a lot longer to mature because they're really putting it in with these other efforts to bring them all forward at the same time. So if we look at each one of these focus areas, these are screenshots out of the document. And like I say, I only include them here in order to provide for a complete record all in one document. But this focus area A around public and private sector commitments, these are the kinds of efforts that are underway now to build the roadmap that they want. Having a common vision, implementing international guidance and principles, and of course, defining common features for cross-border payment and the service levels involved. Regulatory, supervisory, and an oversight framework. A lot of focus on this one. A lot of focus on this one. And as always, regulations tend to chase the technology, but this is one of the few examples that I have found where there's really much more of an effort to address the regulatory issues side by side with how they shape a solution from technology. This is one of those rare instances for that. So here they do want to align regulatory, supervisory, oversight frameworks, applying anti-money laundering rules consistently, comprehensively, et cetera, et cetera. They're looking to promote safer payment corridors. And this is, same as building up any other kind of network. You have certain corridors of payments that dominate, but you need the capability to exist universally. Existing payment infrastructures and arrangements, and I highlight 2 of these with stars, number 10, number 13, that I think Mojaloop can be significant in. Improving direct access to payment systems, broadening the range of eligible candidates for settlement accounts by changing policies and technical standards. And number 13, pursuing the interlinking of payment systems. That's an obvious one. It's really about expanding the interoperability that we talk about with Mojaloop, but moving it even between different countries. So like I say, this is kind of pointing a direction towards the trends in the future. The data and market practices, of course, ISO 20022, message formats, harmonizing API protocols, having unique identifiers, proxy registries. These are all areas that I think that the efforts around Mojaloop have to more or less stay in sync with where this regulatory work has gone, or in the direction this is pointing. New payment infrastructures and arrangements, considering the feasibility of new multilateral platforms and arrangements for cross-border payments. So, fundamentally, I think a lot of this just raises the question of what is Mojaloop's path, future path, and are the actions that we're taking consistent with being able to apply this in cross-border payment scenarios, whether that is cross-border with the same currency as in a monetary union or cross-border with different currencies, and being able to apply foreign exchange and all this. The last one here is a factor on the international dimension into CBDC design. So tomorrow I'll have a different presentation about how I see CBDC coming together with Mojaloop. Stage 3 is the actual roadmap being put forward as a result of this. And what you'll find in the document are these kinds of timelines, and I've truncated it, just showed a little piece of it. These again follow those 19 building blocks organized into these different focus areas. And through each of these different building blocks, there are specific action items that are identified, even to the point of a time scale. And of course, what's identified in this time scale for the future years is just an estimate. But in each case, they've gone through the effort to identify, well, what are some of those specific action items that the industry, broadly spoken, industry, needs to engage in, be involved with, and support this work. So it goes through each of these 5 areas, each of the 5 focus areas, and all 19 building blocks. So the conclusion around this is that, of course, the long-term thinking around how Mojaloop applies requires visibility to policy. And all of this doesn't just apply to the advanced economies. This cross-border thing is relevant everywhere in the world. And cross-border is also something relevant for the unbanked communities who are dependent on remittances. And so this is, in my view, relevant for the long-term thinking of Mojaloop. Isn't going to solve what has to be addressed right now this year, but I think the long-term planning has to be tied more closely with policy initiatives and the regulatory work. The regulatory side is making quite a concerted effort to not lag so far behind the technology. So there are international institutions that are defining requirements, and they're working to address these new methods of payments. There are new use cases for cross-border, either same currency or different currency, that I think Mojaloop can accommodate in the future. CBDCs are seen very definitely as intersecting with these different payment networks. And like I've been saying, regulations here are actually much more in tune with where the future is headed than normally. So there's a reading list here. These are the links with all the different reports that went into this effort. The G20 had a big focus on this, and I think it's persistent. I think it will carry along. We'll hear more about it. So in the few minutes that I've got left, I would be happy to take some questions. We've got maybe 4 minutes in all this.
Yes, we do, David. Thanks so much for that. I see a comment, a question from Maxim in the chat. Do you want to respond to that?
I haven't seen the chat.
I'll give you a second to do that.
Yeah, I'm going to stop my screen sharing.
Sure, that's fine.
And then I can see the chat. Here we go.
Yeah.
While the development of standards and recommendations is an important activity, it must be done. Do you think it moves much slower than actual projects related to cross-border payments and especially central banks? For instance, Buna project that is live already and actively increasing the number of central banks connected to this system. You know, normally I definitely would have agreed that it normally does move much, much slower. What the sense I have that's happening now is that this work by the G20 and trying to establish a roadmap for this work, I think has had the effect to slow down some of the CBDC developments in particular. It's making the technical side move more slowly, because they're trying to be clear that before they implement any kind of a solution, they want to have a much clearer view of how money laundering, regulations, authentication, national IDs, and competition in those advanced markets where that's more relevant. They really want to know how those pieces are going to fit together up front. And that's the sense I have in that point. From what we can see, many global and regional initiatives are struggling to move to an active phase due to endless discussion about practices. That is so true. That is really so true. There has been so much discussion. Now, it was, I thought, very, very interesting in the last session where Paul put up the chart about the Bank of England's view of a digital currency platform, the CBDC platform. That is a model that I think a lot of central banks really do focus on. And I'll save that for tomorrow's discussion, because I really think that's the active phase that they're trying to go to. But before they get to this active phase, they really are trying to not just have a business model for how digital payments are going to work. They're trying to really have the supervisory and money laundering concerns mapped out very clearly, so that technical solutions will have to demonstrate their compliance against that, at least to the spirit of it, if they don't yet have all the standards worked out. But I see an increased focus on it, basically.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, David. For those of you who are asking, the slides are up on the agenda page on GitHub, and they're also in the community forums, the topic for this particular session. Please leave us your feedback for this session in the polls going on right now. Thank you so much, David.